Hello, this is Abnormal Psychology, and we are discussing dissociative disorders. And this is part two. I want to talk to you now about dissociative identity disorder. This used to be called multiple personality disorder, and it's much rarer than we once thought it was, particularly in the 80s when it became the diagnosis du jour. It was suddenly very much more increasingly diagnosed, which likely means that clinicians were making mistakes and misdiagnosing people. It could also have other reasons for its increase in diagnosis, including people who believed they had it and perhaps became more multiple-like. People who are very suggestive, people who are very dependent might have been in the mix there. We don't know exactly, but dissociative identity disorder. So patients with this disorder will come in saying, I can't remember parts of where I was or what I was doing, but people tell me I was there. Many people say I was there, and I have no memory of it. I went to a wedding, and I was told I went to a wedding. I don't remember that I went to a wedding, and they told me I had cake and I danced, but I don't remember that at all. I thought I wasn't invited. They'll say things like that. Loss of time. Now, the first thing you would want to think about would be substance abuse, such as alcohol. And then if that's not present, you would want to think about physiological issues such as brain lesions and traumatic brain injury and so on. It's hard to pin this one down, but let me give you the diagnostic criteria, okay? So the first thing is you have to have two or more very distinct personalities. There has to be this discontinuity in oneself and consciousness, memory, perception, thoughts, and sensory motor functioning. And those two or more personalities have great distinctions in those areas of personality. Okay? In fact, some of those, what we call altered personalities, can have accents or other skills. They may smoke or not. They may be different ages. They may be different genders. Okay? There can be that much of a difference. Obviously, there are gaps in this everyday sequence of events that they will not be able to recall. This is not something that typically we think occurs automatically with some adult traumatic event, but usually we think is consistent with early childhood sexual abuse, in which the brain compartmentalizes, that word again, in order to endure and survive the horrors of the abuse. Now, the overwhelming majority of people who have been abused in horrific ways don't develop DID. So we don't know what the differences are. I'll talk about that shortly. About 1% of the population, something like that. And so what you'll see is that as these alters show themselves in different places, you may or may not realize that the others exist. You may only know the one. I may have DID, and the only alter you know is Professor Rich. I may have alters otherwise. I don't believe I do, but it's possible. The alters don't know about each other either. There may be what we call a memory trace, which is the dominant personality that becomes aware of the other personalities, the alters. Okay? And so what is this all about? Well, it's this idea that in early childhood, the brain is not fully functioning in a seamless fashion. That part of the maturation process of our neural systems, okay, and there are different systems within the brain that are operating, both in terms of sensory motor, memory, all sorts of things, right, are all operating ultimately, hopefully, seamlessly, but those processes are not glued together in a complete way, so that when someone experiences a highly traumatic event that feels life-threatening, and it could very well be, it doesn't have to be just abuse, it could be anything that's highly traumatic, or a series of traumas that are not abuse per se, but the seamlessness is lost because processes associated with identity are driven into places that are not as well connected. Not that they're moving into a different place, they're simply not as well connected as they should have been. Okay? Now, you'll hear sometimes that there is a herky-jerky movement when people switch alters. There's like this, or a sneeze maybe, a cough, and then another alter comes out. That may happen, but it may not happen. Okay? Not a lot of studies are available on this disorder because it's rare enough that we don't have large numbers of people to generate a reasonable sample size. So the average number of alters in one study was thought to be 15. I don't know if that's true. Onset begins in childhood but may only emerge later. That's probably true. And it runs a chronic wax and wane course. That's probably true. Okay. Something that we do know from our small sample size is that the suicide risk is high. The attempted suicide risk is astronomical. Okay. So that's based on minimal data, but you could argue it, and if you're ever in an abnormal class or a clinical class and the professor asks you, what are the most dangerous in terms of suicidal attempt or suicide completion disorders, you can bring this one up. So we know that people with DID are much easier to hypnotize than other people, but that's after the fact. We don't have measures of the overall population. We do, but it's not good information about how easy people are able to be hypnotized, and then see the connection between, except in gross numbers, the difference between the population who are those that develop DID based on trauma and those that are not people who develop DID but remain easily hypnotizable. You get some idea of that, but it's not a real good measure. So this disorder really in the 1940s was one that occupied only about 100 known cases. By 85 to 95, that decade, 20,000 cases. Yeah, that's what I was talking about earlier. Some people think that this diagnosis does not have enough validity to be called out as a diagnosis itself. About a fourth of all psychiatrists in one study made that assumption or assertion. Some people think that the mind is choosing a pathology from options presented by the culture. Some people think that the illness is a way to save face. Not sure about that one. That personal failings is brought on, maybe not consciously, or partially consciously. There's not a consciousness and unconsciousness switch that I think we're used to thinking about, right? There are some things that are within a range of highly conscious and alert and so on, and then all the way down to unconscious, not sleeping. That would be below sleeping. knocked on the head, really. We do know that some alters have measurable differences physiologically, like optical changes, and visual acuity is different. There's some fMRI data with changes in brain functioning when people with this disorder switch personalities when they're in the fMRI. PET scans show differences. Yeah. So I think I want you to know that there are two cases just briefly to talk about. One is Eve. Her name is Chris Sizemore. There's a book about this and a movie. There's always a movie about this event. And it was kind of panned by clinicians because it was overly dramatized. There were 22 personalities, and this person, Chris Sizemore, had a very terrible upbringing with lots of trauma in her childhood. And the movie and book only talk about 3 personalities: Eve White, Eve Black, and Jane, the mature intellectual. Well, I happened to meet Chris Sizemore before she passed away, and she was very deliberate in a talk she gave that I was present at, and was fully reorganized. So that's part of what the treatment is you have a very supportive psychotherapeutic relationship, and you uncover the different alters, you become aware of them as a clinician, and slowly but surely you help all of them become aware of each other, including the dominant personality, and slowly but surely they move together over time. It's long-term psychotherapy. And you've got to watch out for sudden switches, which will occur as a way to protect the person, because remember, this compartmentalization into alters is to avoid ultimate stressors and trauma, and trying to reintegrate those constitutes a trauma to the different alters, potentially. There's another case called Sybil, and Sybil's true name was Shirley Mason. This was back in the 80s, I think. At any rate, her true name is Shirley Mason, and she was the one who set the curve for what was then multiple personality disorder as a syndrome that was created by early childhood sexual abuse. She claimed to have, or the therapist actually claimed to have, 16 separate personalities that all had different talents and characteristics, and one had a British accent, and some were male, and some played the piano, and so forth. And a book was produced in connection with the therapist who treated her. The therapist who treated her believes that it was real. But in 1998, several publications had a strong logical stream to declare that this case was a scam, and it was needed for her to have the diagnosis in order to sell a book. And then later it became a movie, which was thoroughly panned by people in the business of psychology and psychiatry as being outrageous, It is very difficult to claim this disorder in a plea of insanity for a crime that you are accused of committing. It has been claimed, and in several cases it has been shown to be true, but in most cases it doesn't stick. If you want to watch a pretty good movie, it's a fiction, but it's pretty interesting if you like crime and psychology overlaps. It's called Primal Fear with Richard Gere. I think it's a 1998 movie. I'm not sure. No, 2098. Okay. Good movie. I don't want to spoil it for you, so I won't talk about it more than that. So it's very difficult to tell who has this disorder. Very difficult. You see, we, you, me, and everyone have different talents and different abilities, and different things emerge in different environments, different social contexts, because different attributes and different behaviors are required to navigate those environments. There are different things that are supposed to be exhibited and things that are supposed to be inhibited, you see? Okay. Hope you enjoyed that. Talk to you soon. Bye.